Hi and welcome. Today's lesson, which is on the Cold War, and I'm reporting to you from the Herb Brooks Arena in Lake Placid, New York, which is a historic arena, which we will get to. It's very important in the Cold War. We'll get to that history in just a little while on why I would be reporting from this particular place. So the first thing we want to talk about is what is the Cold War? So the Cold War, as the name implies, is a war that does not involve any physical fighting. It's nothing to do with the ice. Well, ironically, there's no ice today either. But it's not referring to temperature. It's referring to the actual military or lack thereof military problems in the war. So it's a war on ideologies. What does that mean? Well, after World War II, two world superpowers came into play. Those two superpowers were the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States was a democratic republic, and the Soviet Union was a communist government. These two ideologies of government did not get along, to say the least. So for the next so many years, we're looking at 1945 to 1991, give or take. Some historians debate those dates. So we're looking at those dates for this time, and a lot of stuff happens in this time frame, which can all be kind of contributed to this idea of these two superpowers not getting along, which leads us to a vocab term, which is containment, which pretty much means like stay where you are, don't go any further, and that's the United States policy on communism at the time. They say, okay, communism was okay, however, don't come any closer, stay where you are. We're not going to allow the spread of communism into any other country, which leads to probably 90% of the problems in the Cold War timeframe. So, what does this mean for us and what things came from it? Well, we're going to look at things like the Korean conflict, the Vietnamese conflict, the arms race, the mutually assured destruction, Olympic history. It was all going to kind of fall under this term. So let's jump right into this. This is just an introduction, so there's lots of other places out there to get more information, but this is a good jumping start for you. So the first thing I want to talk about is is Korea. So Korea is a Asian country. It was one nation, and in the 1940s, the Red Chinese, the Communist Chinese, came in and started to take control over Korea. And the United States had this policy again of containment, keep away. We don't want communism to spread. So the United States said we can't allow this, and we're going to go help the Korean people. Now, the United States technically is not the one involved in this conflict. The UN, the United Nations, is the one who are taking control here. This is important, but the U.S. troops take up about 90% of UN forces. So it's not technically a U.S. war. Congress never declared war. It is a UN conflict. But again, 90% of those troops were American troops. So what are they fighting for? Well, there's a very important number. It's the 38th parallel. And the 38th parallel is referring to the line of latitude that separates North and South Korea. The idea is that communism can be north of the 38th parallel line, but no further. Below that would be South Korea, and that's where communism can't spread. So what we have is Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of the U.S. troops, who said, okay, once we got to the 38th parallel, he said, I'm not done with this. I'm going to keep going. And he pushed further into North Korea. And that's ultimately what led to his demise. He was not told to do this by Harry Truman, who was the president of the United States at the time, but continued to, and it led to the failure of the United States in Korea. So the next thing we want to talk about, as far as another idea of containment, stay away, is the Vietnam conflict, which again is not technically a war. The United States never declared war in Vietnam, but it's got all the makings of war. So what Vietnam is referring to is, again, North and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was in danger, or was already communist, was fighting communism, and at the time it was run by the French Indo-Chinese, and France had control of it, and they said, okay, we want to make sure that this doesn't spread any further. So the American troops went into Vietnam to try to hold back or contain communism once again. And it was not so successful. Ultimately, the United States troops were left under from Nixon, and the United States was not successful in the Vietnamese conflict. The next thing I want to talk about is the space race. So on a political end, there were lots of things that both Russia and the United States wanted to dominate in. One of them was the idea of getting into space. The U.S. Were the first of the two superpowers to make it to the moon. However, the Soviets were the first to launch Sputnik, which was the first satellite into space. And they had the first astronaut or cosmonaut in space. But this led to some really awesome situations in U.S.-Soviet history because it pushed each country further and further, so everyone got kind of better and better, and science got better and better because neither one wanted them to win, which kind of also leads me to where I'm sitting with you right now, which is the Herb Brooks Arena. This is where the United States U.S. hockey team, which was comprised mostly of young college players / some recent graduates who played a hockey game against the Soviet Union, who were seasoned professionals, and they won and ultimately won the U.S. A gold medal in hockey in the 1980s Olympic game. And of course, it has no official political standings, but the Soviets thought that they dominated in hockey particularly, and so to lose to the Americans was quite a blow to the Soviet people and to the Soviet government. But that's just kind of a little side note. You're probably not going to see that on any major exam, but it's kind of fun to know. The other thing that we want to talk about is called the nuclear arms race, which is the idea that the United States and the Soviet Union both had military power, and both were continuing to up and up and up each other's power play, with more, as more arms were created, the other side also was increasing their nuclear powers. So, so it built higher and higher standards of atomic missiles, and it also led to something called MAD, which is mutually assured destruction, which meant that both the United States and the Soviet Union had the power to blow the world up, very important, and that really if one person decided, okay, we're going to let this fly, the other country would do it too, so ultimately we'd all lose, which was a really scary situation for both countries. One other thing I want to talk about is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, most of what we've been talking about as far as communism spreading has been in Asia, in the constant fear that it was going to spread more into Europe. And one of the things that really struck America as pretty scary was when the Soviet Union started to come into the Western Hemisphere. So what we have is Cuba, which had been controlled more or less by the United States since Teddy Roosevelt time, had now fallen to Cuban revolutionaries, Fidel Castro being the most prominent. And he was a communist dictator, friends with the Soviet Union, and that made America really uncomfortable. So the Americans decided that they were going to carry out the Bay of Pigs invasion, and this was under JFK. So JFK agreed for this assault, however, he did not arm the people that were going to fight Castro, and it was a complete failure. Very uncomfortable for all involved. And at the same time, he was also conducting something called Operation Mongoose, which was a coup to get rid of Fidel Castro. It was unsuccessful also, and perhaps the worst part of that was that it was known that the United States government was trying to get rid of Castro, which then scared the Cuban government more and more, and they said, okay, we're now going to have to come up with something against the United States since they're clearly trying to overpower us. So their answer was, well, let's bring nuclear missiles over to the United States, or to Cuba. So they did. So the Cubans now have missiles pointed at the United States. And keep in mind, Cuba is only 90 miles from southern Florida, so this was quite a scary time. So that's referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Americans were able to send a spy plane, U-2, not the band, a plane, over and to Cuba to discover that yes, they did have missiles pointed at the United States. So again, that's pretty much what we really want to look at when we are talking at the Cold War. So again, key things to think about is containment. Again, the idea that the Soviets the communism can stay where it is, can't creep any further. We don't want it to come to the United States. We don't want it to go to any other countries that it shouldn't be in. I do have actually one other thing I want to point out is what happened to Germany after World War II. So after World War II, Germany was split up into 4 pieces. 3 of those 4 pieces were controlled by the democratic countries in World War II, most notably United States, England, and France. I'm gonna move out a little bit. There's my 3. Can't see it. There they are. Those 3 countries, and the other 4th one would be the Soviet Union. 4 would be the Soviet Union, and so the 3 got along quite harmoniously, and allowed Germany to be a free democracy. However, that 4th section was controlled by the Soviets. It was a communist part of Germany. And the weirdest thing about it was Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, was smack dab in the middle of the communist section of Germany. And what the winning allies decided to do was to take Berlin, and divide Berlin up into communism and democracy. So inside of Berlin, you have a chunk of democracy surrounded by a sea of communism. And so this was quite confusing, and really kept Germany in a really bizarre position, so that it was not a unified country, that clearly they had some struggles that they had to deal with after World War II, and not allowing that to go any further. So again, to wrap up communism, you've got wrap up the Cold War, you've got communism versus democracy. So a free society of communism would be about an economic and social aspect of freedom, where communism is going to limit your control by the government. And then from there, we want to remember Korea, which is an idea of containment, keeping communism where it is. Don't pass that 38th parallel. Then we want to look at Vietnam, again, another form of containment. We are helping to support the French, keep Vietnam a democracy. Doesn't go so well, it does fall, and is still a communist country today. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is keeping the United States safe from communism on its own hemisphere. We have the idea of mutually assured destruction. So if you blow us up, we're going to blow you up. We have the building up of arms to begin with, the nuclear arms race. Yeah, and that's, so we got a space race as well. We're going to beat you to the moon and back. So how does this all end? Very slowly. The Cold War has to start by having Soviet leaders who are willing to speak with the United States. And so that starts to happen, and we call that time period détente, which is when we start to build a friendship. And we also have something called glasnost, which means openness, that the two countries are going to be willing to talk to each other. And so that is exactly what starts to happen. Under the Soviets, under Gorbachev, start to have good relations with the United States leaders. At this time, we're looking at President Reagan was kind of a forerunner in this. And that glasnost, that openness, allows the United States and the Soviet Union to kind of come down with some regulations. They do something called SALT, which limits the amount of nuclear arms that are being developed and kind of starting to dismantle some of the nuclear weapons. And ultimately, in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union does collapse, and communism is stopped in the Soviet Union. There are still communist countries left in the world today. We've talked about many of them. And that's pretty much it. So when you're taking your exam, please keep in mind containment, holding back those Soviets, and that's it. All right, have a great day. Oh, and again, here we are, the beautiful Herb Bricks Arena. All right, bye.